Richard Blackwood thought he knew every secret in his mansion. The Gothic Revival estate had been in his family for 3 generations, its stone walls holding memories of countless dinner parties, business deals, and quiet moments of solitude. But when he came home at 2 a.m. to find his maid waiting in the dark, her hand covering his mouth as she whispered, "Don't speak," he realized some secrets are worth dying for. What happened in those terrifying moments would shatter everything he thought he knew about trust, loyalty, and the woman who had quietly protected his world for 15 years. Before we dive into this incredible true story, I want you to imagine something. What would you do if your most trusted employee suddenly became your protector in the most dangerous moment of your life? Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever had someone completely surprise you when you needed them most? And if you love stories about unlikely heroes and life-changing moments, hit that subscribe button because we share these incredible tales every week. Trust me, what Maria did that night will leave you speechless. The Blackwood estate sat like a fortress on 12 acres of manicured grounds, 40 minutes outside the city where the old money families had built their retreats. Wrought iron gates, security cameras, and a winding driveway that seemed to go on forever. It was the kind of place that made visitors whisper and staff members tread lightly. The mansion itself was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, with its towering spires, arched windows, and gargoyles that seemed to watch everything with stone eyes. During the day, sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across marble floors. But at night, the place transformed into something altogether more imposing, shadows stretching like fingers through corridors that had witnessed generations of Blackwood family drama. Richard had inherited this world at 28 when his father died in a helicopter crash, leaving behind a tech empire worth $300 million and a son who had never quite fit the mold. Unlike his father, who had been a natural politician and schmoozer, Richard was brilliant but awkward, more comfortable with code than cocktail parties. He'd turned the family's traditional manufacturing business into a cutting-edge software company, developing security systems that governments and corporations paid billions to license. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd built his fortune protecting other people's secrets while living increasingly isolated in his own fortress. The divorce papers had been finalized 6 months ago. Victoria had taken half his liquid assets and moved to Monaco, claiming she needed space to find herself. What she'd really needed was space to continue her affair with her tennis instructor, but Richard's lawyers had advised him not to contest the settlement. "Pick your battles," they'd said. "You'll make the money back in 2 years." But what they couldn't calculate was the cost of coming home every night to a house that echoed with emptiness, where every room reminded him of conversations that would never happen again and dreams that had quietly died in designer furniture and imported marble. That's when Maria Elena Vasquez became more than just the head housekeeper. She became the only constant in a world that seemed determined to shift beneath his feet. Maria had started working for the Blackwood family when Richard was still in college, a young single mother from Guatemala who spoke broken English but worked with the intensity of someone who understood that every opportunity was precious. She'd been hired by Richard's mother, Catherine, who had seen something in the serious young woman with calloused hands and determined eyes. "She notices things," Catherine had told her son. "And she cares about them too." It was a quality that had made Maria invaluable during the chaotic years after his father's death, when business rivals circled like vultures and family friends revealed themselves to be anything but. 15 years later, Maria's English was flawless, though she still carried traces of her accent like jewelry, beautiful, distinctive, and worn with quiet pride. She'd transformed from a nervous young woman into the backbone of the estate, managing a staff of 12 with the efficiency of a military commander and the warmth of a favorite aunt. Her son Diego was 17 now, a senior in high school with acceptance letters to 3 universities, though he didn't know yet that his mother had been quietly saving every penny for his tuition while turning down Richard's repeated offers to simply write a check. "Mijo," she would tell Diego when he asked about college costs, "some things you earn with your own hands. Other things are gifts. You need to know the difference." Maria knew the Blackwood estate better than anyone, including Richard himself. She'd memorized the locations of every hidden safe, every secret passage that his grandfather had built during Prohibition, every weak point in the security system that she'd noticed but never mentioned. She knew which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck in humidity, and which rooms collected shadows even in daylight. More importantly, she knew Richard's patterns with the precision of someone who had made it her job to anticipate his needs before he recognized them himself. He left for the office every morning at exactly 6:47 a.m., driving himself in the black Tesla despite having a driver on staff. He preferred coffee black, eggs over easy, and toast barely golden. He read 3 newspapers with breakfast: the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and the local paper, though he'd stopped reading the society pages after the divorce. He worked 16-hour days not because he had to, but because the alternative was coming home to silence. When he did return, usually around 10 p.m., he'd pour himself 2 fingers of Macallan 25, sit in his father's study, and review security reports from his company while pretending not to notice how the house felt like a museum of his own life. Maria had watched this routine with growing concern. She'd seen how the lines around his eyes had deepened, how his shoulders carried tension like a physical weight, how he'd started jumping at unexpected sounds. When she asked if he was sleeping well, he'd give her a smile that didn't reach his eyes and change the subject. When she suggested he take a vacation, he'd remind her about the pending hostile takeover attempt and the 3 government contracts under review. When she worried aloud about his safety, he'd pat her shoulder and tell her not to fret about things beyond her control. But Maria Vasquez had learned long ago that nothing was beyond her control if she was willing to pay attention and act when necessary. The threats had started subtly, the way these things always do in the world of high-stakes business. Anonymous emails that could have been spam but weren't. Phone calls that hung up when answered. Cars that seemed to follow the same route as Richard's Tesla, never close enough to be certain but always present enough to be noticed. At least, they would have been noticed by someone who was looking. Richard wasn't looking. He was buried in code, lost in algorithms, focused on a new security protocol that would revolutionize how financial institutions protected client data. The irony was painful. He was creating systems to keep other people safe while remaining oblivious to the dangers circling his own life like sharks in dark water. Maria noticed because noticing was her superpower, honed by years of watching over a household where privacy and security weren't luxuries but necessities. She noticed the same florist van parked across from the estate gates 3 days in a row, even though no deliveries were scheduled. She noticed the new groundskeeper who seemed more interested in sight lines than rose bushes. She noticed how the security company had suddenly requested updated floor plans and staff schedules, citing routine maintenance that felt anything but routine. Most of all, she noticed the change in Richard's business partner, Marcus Webb. Marcus had been Richard's college roommate, best man at his wedding, and co-founder of Blackwood Security Systems. They'd built the company together, sharing dreams and late-night coding sessions and the kind of friendship that survives everything life throws at it. Or so Richard believed. Maria had never trusted Marcus, though she'd never been able to articulate exactly why. There was something in the way he looked at the estate, calculating square footage and worth. Something in how he asked casual questions about Richard's schedule, his habits, his security measures at home. Something in his smile that never seemed to reach his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The hostile takeover attempt had brought these suspicions into sharp focus. Meridian Corp, a shadowy consortium of international investors, had made an initial offer for Blackwood Security that was insultingly low but strategically timed. They'd followed it with whisper campaigns about Richard's mental state after the divorce, his increasing isolation, his erratic decision-making. When Richard had laughed off their second offer, Meridian had begun approaching key clients directly, suggesting that Blackwood Security might not be the stable partner they'd once been. "They're trying to destroy the company's value before they steal it," Richard had explained to Maria over one of their increasingly rare shared dinners. Classic hostile takeover playbook. "But they're underestimating us." Maria had nodded and served him more of the arroz con pollo he barely touched these days, but privately she wondered if Richard was the one doing the underestimating. She'd seen this kind of predatory behavior before, in the small Guatemalan village where she'd grown up, where powerful men took what they wanted and convinced themselves it was business, not theft. Her father had taught her to recognize such men. Carlos Vasquez had been a sergeant in the Guatemalan army, a man who'd seen enough conflict to understand that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who smiled while they sharpened their knives. He'd taught his daughter to read body language like text, to notice details that others missed, and to trust her instincts even when they contradicted what seemed logical. Mija, he'd told her before she left for America, in this world, there are sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs. The sheep don't see danger until it's too late. The wolves pretend to be sheep until they're ready to strike. But the sheepdogs, they watch. They notice. And when the wolves show their teeth, the sheepdogs are ready. Maria had carried those words with her for 23 years, through the difficult early days of immigration, through the challenges of single motherhood, through the slow process of building a life in a country that demanded she prove her worth every single day. She'd become Richard's sheepdog without him realizing it, watching over his world with the quiet intensity of someone who understood that evil rarely announced itself with fanfare. The pieces had started falling into place 3 weeks before that terrifying night. Maria had been dusting Richard's home office when she'd overheard a phone conversation that made her blood run cold. Marcus had called to discuss the Meridian situation, but something in his tone set off every alarm bell her father had taught her to hear. "Don't worry about the security at the house," Marcus had said, his voice carrying through the speakerphone with casual confidence. "I've been there 100 times. I know the layout, the schedules, everything. The cameras have blind spots, and the staff goes home at 8 except for Maria, but she's just the housekeeper. Just the housekeeper." The dismissal in his voice was like a physical slap, but it was also information. Marcus was planning something, and he was stupid enough to underestimate the woman who had been taking care of his best friend for 15 years. Maria had finished her dusting and returned to her quarters, her mind racing. She'd pulled out the tablet Richard had given her for managing household schedules and begun researching Meridian Corp with the methodical patience her father had taught her. What she'd found had confirmed her worst fears. Meridian wasn't just trying to buy Blackwood security. They were systematically destroying it. 3 of Richard's biggest clients had received detailed technical information about Blackwood's security protocols, information that could only have come from inside the company. 2 government contracts had been lost after someone leaked details about Blackwood's bidding strategy. A lawsuit had appeared from nowhere, filed by a competitor who somehow knew about a minor software glitch that should have been confidential. Someone was feeding Meridian information from inside Blackwood security. Someone with access to everything. Someone Richard trusted completely. The realization had hit her like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just betraying his business partner. He was orchestrating the complete destruction of his best friend's life. But Maria's research had uncovered something even more chilling. Meridian Corp wasn't just buying companies, they were eliminating obstacles. 3 CEOs who had refused their offers had suffered accidents in the past 2 years. A car crash in Sao Paulo. A hiking mishap in Colorado. A heart attack in Singapore that medical experts found suspiciously convenient. Richard wasn't just losing his company. He was a marked man, and he had no idea. The next morning, Maria had tried to warn him. She'd approached the subject carefully, starting with general concerns about security and working toward her specific discoveries. But Richard had been distracted, focused on a new encryption algorithm that he was convinced would save the company. When she'd mentioned her concerns about Marcus, he'd actually laughed. "Maria, I know you've never warmed up to Marcus, but he's been my partner for 12 years. He's like a brother to me. You're seeing conspiracies where there's just business competition." She'd pushed harder, showing him the research she'd compiled, the patterns she'd identified, the connections between Meridian and the suspicious accidents. Richard had listened with the patience of someone humoring a beloved but paranoid relative. "I appreciate you looking out for me," he'd said, squeezing her shoulder with genuine affection. "But you're connecting dots that aren't there. Marcus and I are handling the Meridian situation. Everything's under control." Everything was not under control. Over the following weeks, Maria had watched the threats escalate while Richard remained obliviously focused on his work. The mysterious cars became more frequent. The hang-up calls increased. A window in the east wing had been found unlocked 3 mornings in a row, despite Maria's certainty that she'd secured it the night before. Most ominously, Marcus had begun visiting the estate more frequently, always with plausible business reasons but always asking questions that had nothing to do with software development. Where did Richard keep his personal files? Had he updated his will recently? Did he have any security measures that Marcus didn't know about? Maria had answered these questions carefully, giving Marcus just enough information to seem helpful while withholding the details that might prove crucial. She'd also begun her own preparations, drawing on skills her father had taught her that she'd never expected to use in the marble halls of a millionaire's mansion. She'd memorized the locations of every weapon in the house, the antique swords in the library, the letter opener in Richard's desk, the set of German knives in the kitchen that could stop a heart as easily as they could julienne vegetables. She'd tested every lock, every window, every potential entry point until she could navigate the house blindfolded. Most importantly, she'd begun staying late, long after the rest of the staff had gone home, positioning herself where she could watch and listen for the danger she knew was coming. Richard's routine had become even more predictable as the stress mounted. He'd leave earlier, return later, and disappear into his study with barely a word. The 2 fingers of Macallan had become 3, then 4. The pretense of dinner had been abandoned entirely. Maria would find him asleep at his desk more mornings than not, his face pressed against reports he'd never finished reading. The night it all came apart had started like any other. Richard had left for the office at 6:47 a.m., kissing Maria's cheek in the distracted way that had become their morning ritual. He'd mentioned a late meeting with potential investors, something about a presentation that could save the company. He'd seemed almost optimistic for the first time in weeks, his step lighter as he'd walked to his car. Maria had watched him drive away with a feeling of dread she couldn't shake. Something about the timing felt wrong, the way pieces of a puzzle suddenly snap into place to reveal a picture you don't want to see. By 8 p.m., the rest of the staff had gone home, leaving Maria alone in the vast estate. She'd done her evening rounds, checking locks and setting the security system, but instead of retiring to her quarters, she'd settled into the shadows of the main staircase with a clear view of the front entrance and the driveway beyond. At 9:15, her instincts proved correct. 3 men in dark clothing approached the estate on foot, having left their vehicle somewhere beyond the security camera's range. They moved with military precision, communicating through hand signals as they disabled the perimeter sensors with equipment that suggested professional training and inside knowledge of the security system's vulnerabilities. Maria had watched from her hiding place as they'd entered through the servants' entrance, a door that should have been unknown to anyone outside the family and staff. They'd moved through the house like ghosts, setting up positions that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the floor plan. 2 had taken positions in the main living room where Richard always stopped to collect his mail. The 3rd had positioned himself in the study, where Richard's evening routine would inevitably lead him. They were waiting to kill him, and they knew exactly how to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Maria had felt the familiar surge of ice-cold clarity that her father had called combat calm. This was the moment she'd been preparing for without knowing it, 15 years of loyalty and love and protection crystallizing into a choice that would define everything that came after. She could call the police, but by the time they arrived, Richard would be dead and the killers would be gone. She could trigger the security alarm, but these men had already proven they could disable the system. She could run, save herself, and let the morning bring the inevitable news of tragedy. Or she could trust the skills her father had given her and the knowledge 15 years in this house had provided, and save the man who had become family in all the ways that mattered. Maria Vasquez chose to fight. Moving with the silent precision her father had drilled into her during childhood games that hadn't been games at all, she'd positioned herself near the front door where Richard would enter. She'd armed herself with the 8-inch chef's knife from the kitchen, its blade sharp enough to split a hair, and waited for perfect balance in her small hands. And then she'd waited, counting heartbeats and controlling her breathing, while 3 professional killers settled into their positions and prepared to end the life of the man she'd sworn to protect. At 2:03 a.m., Richard's Tesla had turned into the driveway, its headlights sweeping across windows where death waited in the darkness. Maria had taken her position beside the front door, knife ready, knowing she would have perhaps 2 seconds to save his life or watch him die. The key had turned in the lock with the soft click that had marked the end of 1,000 ordinary evenings. But this evening was anything but ordinary, and as Richard stepped across the threshold into his own home, Maria realized that everything they'd both taken for granted was about to change forever. Richard stepped through the doorway, his mind still processing the disappointing meeting with the investors. Another door closing, another piece of his empire crumbling while he watched helplessly. He reached for the light switch, muscle memory guiding his hand in the familiar darkness. That's when Maria struck. Her hand clamped over his mouth with surprising strength, her body pressing against his back as she whispered urgently in his ear, "Don't speak. Don't move. Don't make a sound." The knife in her other hand caught the faint moonlight streaming through the stained glass windows. Richard's first instinct was pure terror. His heart hammered against his ribs as his mind raced through possibilities. Had Maria snapped under some unknown pressure? The woman who had been his rock for 15 years, was she now holding a knife to his life? But then he felt the tremor in her hand, not from fear but from adrenaline-charged focus. He noticed how she'd positioned herself to shield him from the interior of the house. And in the reflection of the hallway mirror, he saw what had made her act with such desperate urgency. 3 figures in black tactical gear stood frozen in his living room, their weapons trained on the doorway where he should have been standing. Professional hitmen, waiting in his own home. Without Maria's intervention, he would have been dead before he could draw another breath. Maria felt Richard's body go rigid with understanding. She pressed her lips closer to his ear, her voice barely a whisper. 3 men. Armed. They've been waiting for 2 hours. We need to move. Now. She guided him backward through the doorway, their movements synchronized like dancers. Each step was calculated as they retreated from the killing ground his home had become. The killers hadn't expected their target to simply vanish, and Maria could hear their confusion in the soft rustle of fabric. Maria had mapped every creaking board in this house during her 15 years of service. Now that intimate familiarity with the estate's secrets was the thin line between life and death. She guided Richard past the grandfather clock, around the Persian rug, toward the alcove beneath the main staircase. Behind them, Maria heard the soft whisper of tactical boots on hardwood. The killers had realized their ambush had failed and were beginning a methodical search. The alcove led to one of the mansion's most closely guarded secrets, a passage Richard's grandfather had built during Prohibition. The entrance was hidden behind a panel that only 3 people knew about: Richard, his late father, and the housekeeper who had discovered it 20 years ago. Maria pressed the hidden catch. The panel swung open silently, revealing a narrow passage that led to the wine cellar. But as they prepared to enter, Richard hesitated. "How did you know?" he whispered. "How long have you known?" Maria's expression was a mixture of vindication and sorrow. 3 weeks, she breathed back. "Your partner Marcus has been feeding them information. They're not just trying to buy your business, Richard. They're eliminating you." The words hit him like physical blows. Marcus. His college roommate, his best man, his business partner for 12 years. If Marcus could betray him, then what in his life was real? As if reading his thoughts, Maria placed her free hand on his cheek. "Not everyone," she whispered. "Some of us stay. Some of us fight. Some of us would die before we let anything happen to family." The word family hung between them like a bridge spanning 15 years of professional boundaries. Richard realized this woman knew him better than his ex-wife ever had, and was willing to risk her life for him without hesitation. A sound from the living room reminded them that sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. Maria tugged Richard toward the passage entrance. "I should call the police," he whispered. Maria shook her head. "By the time they arrive, we'll be dead and these men will be gone. They're professionals, Richard." This was planned down to the minute. The sound of footsteps in the hallway cut short any further discussion. Maria pushed Richard into the passage and followed, pulling the panel closed just as a flashlight beam swept across where they had been standing. The passage was narrow and dark, built for function rather than comfort. They moved through the darkness with Maria leading, her hand on Richard's shoulder. Behind them came the sounds of a systematic search, doors opening, furniture being moved. The passage opened into the wine cellar, a vaulted stone chamber lined with thousands of bottles. Maria led him toward the far wall, where another hidden door led to the root cellar. But as they reached the center, Richard grabbed her arm. If Marcus gave them everything, they'll know about these passages. Maria nodded grimly. But they don't know about the other thing I found down here. She led him to what appeared to be a solid stone wall. When Maria pressed a sequence of stones, a section swung inward on hidden hinges. Your grandfather was more paranoid than you realized, Maria whispered. This leads to a natural cave system that connects to the river. I found it 5 years ago. They had been walking through the cave for perhaps 10 minutes when the first explosion shattered the night. The sound echoed through the stone passages like thunder. What was that? Richard asked. Insurance, Maria replied grimly. I left them a little surprise in the wine cellar. They emerged from the cave system near the river, where dawn was breaking over the water. Richard sat on the old concrete foundation, his expensive suit torn and dirty, his hands shaking as the adrenaline finally began to fade. Maria sat beside him, the knife finally set aside, her uniform disheveled but her posture still alert. What happens now? Richard asked. Now we call the police, Maria replied. But not the local ones. This goes too deep. We call the FBI. This wasn't just about stealing your company, Richard. This was about destroying you completely. Richard nodded, the full scope finally becoming clear. Marcus sold out more than just me. What Maria did next was something no one saw coming, not Richard, not the FBI agents who would arrive 3 hours later, and probably not Marcus Webb when he watched the news reports of his failed assassination attempt. But before I reveal how this incredible woman completely turned the tables on a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of corporate power, I have to ask, are you subscribed yet? Because if stories about ordinary people who become extraordinary heroes inspire you, you definitely don't want to miss what Maria accomplished next. Hit that subscribe button and let's see how a housekeeper brought down an international conspiracy. Maria pulled out her phone, not the smartphone Richard had given her, but an older device that looked like it had been designed for people who needed their communications to be untraceable. She dialed a number from memory, spoke in rapid Spanish, then switched to English. This is Elena Vasquez, authorization code 77 Alpha Tango 9. I need immediate extraction for myself and a protected asset. Richard stared at her. Who did you just call? And what authorization code? Maria looked at him for a long moment. My real name is Elena Vasquez Santos. I'm a deep cover operative for the DEA, assigned to monitor suspected money laundering operations. Your house was supposed to be a simple observation post. That was 15 years ago. The world tilted around Richard. You're a federal agent. Maria corrected. Officially, I went dark 5 years ago when my assignment ended and I chose to stay. Unofficially, I've been keeping an eye on things while raising my son. Richard laughed, somewhere between hysteria and wonder. So my housekeeper is a former federal agent who's been protecting me without me knowing it. Pretty much, Maria said with the first real smile he'd seen from her all night. The sound of helicopters approaching interrupted their conversation. 3 black helicopters landed in the field beyond the dock, disgorging teams of federal agents who moved with professional efficiency. Agent Sarachan had worked with Elena Vasquez Santos for 6 years before Elena had officially retired. Now, seeing Elena in her torn uniform with a combat knife at her side, Sarah realized she'd been naive about the nature of Elena's retirement. What do you have for us, Elena? Conspiracy to commit murder, corporate espionage, probably treason, Elena replied. The primary target is Marcus Webb, Richard's business partner. He's been feeding information to Meridian Corporation. They've been systematically destroying Blackwood Security to get control of systems that protect critical infrastructure. Sarah made notes on her tablet. Evidence? Elena handed over her household tablet. 3 weeks of surveillance data, financial records, communication intercepts. Also, there are currently 3 professional killers trapped in a burning wine cellar. Richard watched this exchange with amazement. The woman he thought he knew was giving a tactical briefing to federal agents with calm competence. What about the asset? Sarah asked, glancing at Richard. He's clean, Elena said firmly. Victim, not participant. Trusted the wrong person and nearly got killed for it. I'm right here, Richard said mildly. Elena turned to him. I'm sorry. I know this is a lot to process. I know you feel betrayed by Marcus, and now you're finding out that I've been lying to you for 15 years about who I really am. Richard considered this. Have you been lying about who you are? Or have you been lying about what you used to do for a living? What do you mean? I mean, did Elena the federal agent care about my well-being? Did she worry when I wasn't eating enough? Did she remember my mother's birthday because it was part of some assignment, or because she thought I needed someone to remember? Elena's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. No assignment lasts 15 years, Richard. I stayed because you became family. Because Diego needed a stable home and you gave us that. Because you reminded me that there are good men in the world worth protecting. Richard reached for her hands. Then you haven't been lying about who you are. You've been exactly who you are, someone who protects the people she loves. Agent Chin cleared her throat. We need to move. Webb will realize his plan failed within the hour. Elena nodded. What do you need from us? Him in protective custody until we're sure we've got everyone. You back on the payroll for the duration. Do I get a vote in this? Richard asked. No, Elena and Sarah said simultaneously. Richard smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. Good. Because I vote to trust Elena with my life. She's earned that right. 3 months later, the trials were over and the conspiracy had been dismantled. Marcus Webb was serving 25 years in federal prison. Richard had rebuilt Blackwood security stronger than ever. Elena had officially returned to federal service as a consultant, designing protection protocols for high-value civilians. But every evening, she still came home to the Blackwood estate, where Diego was completing his senior year and Richard had learned to leave the office at reasonable hours for family dinners. On quiet evenings, Richard and Elena would walk the grounds together. They had become something more complex than simple categories could define. They had become family in the truest sense, people who had chosen each other because they had proven worthy of trust when trust was the difference between life and death. One evening, as they sat on the dock where they had waited for rescue, Richard asked the question that had been building in his mind. Do you ever regret staying? Giving up your federal career to take care of a man who was too blind to see the danger he was in. Elena considered this, watching the water flow past. Do you regret trusting someone who lied to you about her identity for 15 years? You didn't lie about your identity, Richard said firmly. You just didn't mention your resume. And you saved my life. Everything else is details. Then we're even, Elena replied. Because you saved mine too. You gave Diego and me a home when we needed one. You treated us like family when we were just employees. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the water. Two people who had found in each other something neither had been looking for but both had desperately needed. Maria's courage that night didn't just save Richard's life, it transformed both of their worlds forever. Sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones with the deepest strength, just waiting for the right moment to show it. I'm curious, have you ever had someone in your life who surprised you with their courage when you needed it most? Or maybe you've been the Maria in someone else's story. Share your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your incredible stories. And if this story reminded you that heroes come in all forms, please share this video with someone who might need that reminder today. You never know whose life might be changed by seeing the power of unexpected courage. For more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, you know where to find us. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of story lovers. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most important words are the ones whispered in the dark. Don't speak. I've got you, move. Webb will realize his plan failed within the hour, and we need to coordinate arrests across multiple jurisdictions before the network can disappear. Elena nodded, slipping back into professional mode, but she didn't let go of Richard's hands. What do you need from us? Him in protective custody until we're sure we've got everyone. You back on the payroll for the duration of the operation. There's no one else I trust to keep him alive while we dismantle this thing. Richard looked between the two women, federal agents discussing his life like a tactical problem to be solved. 6 hours ago, his biggest worry had been a hostile takeover attempt. Now he was learning that his business partner had tried to have him killed and his housekeeper was a former DEA agent who had been protecting him for years without his knowledge. Do I get a vote in this? He asked. No, Elena and Sarah said simultaneously. Richard smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. Good. Because I vote to trust Elena with my life. She's earned that right. 3 months later, the trials were over and the conspiracy that had reached from corporate boardrooms to international criminal organizations had been dismantled. Marcus Webb was serving 25 years in federal prison, along with 17 co-conspirators who had underestimated the determination of a housekeeper who refused to let anyone harm her family. Richard had rebuilt Blackwood Security with new partners he trusted in security measures that Elena had helped design. The company was stronger than ever, its government contracts renewed and expanded based on systems that had proven unbreachable even by sophisticated criminal networks. Elena had officially returned to federal service as a consultant, designing protection protocols for high-value civilians who faced threats from organized crime. Her expertise in domestic infiltration and long-term surveillance had made her one of the most sought-after specialists in the field. But every evening, she still came home to the Blackwood estate, where Diego was completing his senior year of high school and Richard had learned to leave the office at a reasonable hour for family dinners that had become the highlight of his day. The wine cellar had been rebuilt, but Richard had insisted on keeping the hidden passages and adding a few security features that Elena's federal colleagues had suggested. The house was still a fortress, but now it was a fortress defended by someone who understood both its vulnerabilities and its strengths. On quiet evenings, Richard and Elena would walk the grounds together, checking security measures and discussing the day's events. To anyone watching, they might have seemed like an unlikely pair, the tech millionaire and his former housekeeper, the corporate executive and the federal agent. But they had become something more complex and valuable than simple categories could define. They had become family in the truest sense, people who had chosen each other not because of blood or obligation, but because they had proven worthy of trust when trust was the difference between life and death. One evening, as they sat on the dock where they had waited for rescue on the night that changed everything, Richard asked the question that had been building in his mind for months. Do you ever regret staying? Giving up your federal career to take care of a man who was too blind to see the danger he was in. Elena considered this, watching the water flow past the dock toward futures they couldn't predict. Do you regret trusting someone who lied to you about her identity for 15 years? You didn't lie about your identity, Richard said firmly. You just didn't mention your resume. And you saved my life. Everything else is details. Then we're even, Elena replied. Because you saved mine too. You gave Diego and me a home when we needed one. You treated us like family when we were just employees. You trusted me to protect you even when you didn't know that's what I was doing. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the water. Two people who had found in each other something neither had been looking for but both had desperately needed: unconditional loyalty in a world where trust was a luxury most people couldn't afford. Maria's courage that night didn't just save Richard's life, it transformed both of their worlds forever. Sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones with the deepest strength, just waiting for the right moment to show it. Sometimes the most powerful protection comes not from security systems or bodyguards, but from someone who loves you enough to risk everything when danger comes calling. I'm curious, have you ever had someone in your life who surprised you with their courage when you needed it most? Or maybe you've been the Maria in someone else's story. Share your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your incredible stories. And if this story reminded you that heroes come in all forms, Please share this video with someone who might need that reminder today. You never know whose life might be changed by seeing the power of unexpected courage and unwavering loyalty. For more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, you know where to find us. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of story lovers who believe that the most powerful moments in life often come from the most unexpected places. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most important words are the ones whispered in the dark. Don't speak. I've got you.